Hello, everybody. Good evening. Please welcome on the stage one of the most acclaimed Hollywood film editors of contemporary times, Mr. Joe Walker.
Dobry večer. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to waste precious time with personal stories, but still, I have to tell something. We met with Joe in 2011 on the documentary film festival in Tel Aviv. He was there with his wonderful documentary, A Life and Day. And at the time, I was there with my colleague, co-director Martin Dušek, and we were really beginners. And we asked Joe, how does it goes with the filmmaking? Can you live on that? Is it worth it somehow? Can you live like a filmmaker? He was at that time based in London. And he said, "Yeah, I really love film editing. It's great. It's perfect. But I composed a music for the language tutorial video, and it made a lot of money for me. And plus, they did another versions of this tutorial video for Spanish, for Chinese, for everything. So it brought me another money, and I could live my family out of that. So, okay, yeah, film editing, very, very good, but the music for the language video, does it work still like that?" Well, things obviously.
It was actually the worst piece of music I ever wrote. So go figure.
Yeah, so the things has obviously changed since that time. Joe moved to Hollywood, and he became one of the really best film editors there, and he cooperates, of course, as you know, with Denis Villeneuve and with Steve McQueen repeatedly. And last time when he was here in Cinergy 5 years ago in Prague, he has already been nominated for Oscar for a film 12 Years a Slave. And now after another 5 years, you have already won the Oscar for the film. So incredible career. Congratulations, Joe. Fantastic.
Thank you. You know, one of the best things about winning an Oscar, and if I can boast a little bit, is the fact that people tell you this is going to happen, and you don't believe it until it happens to you, which is you can go to any party. And my publicist said, "You've won the Oscar, where do you want to go?" And I said, "I want to go to the Vanity Fair party," because I heard there were some good people going. I have no idea where it is. I don't have an invitation. So they said, "It's fine. We'll get a limo, we drive." So we drove, we went to this place, Annenberg, and the road narrows, and eventually you're stopped. You know, it's like you've been squeezed into a small space, and my limo driver was freaking out a little bit. And a man comes towards the car, and he's dressed in a very good suit, and he has an earpiece, and he comes to the driver, and he says to the driver, "And you are?" And I had my Oscar, and I just pressed the window, and it went, and he said, "We've been waiting for you." So this is the best thing about Oscar night.
Last time when you were here, we ended the discussion with Blade Runner, and you were just about to start your next project at that time, which was Dune Part 1. So I would like to start really from the very beginning. Very simple question: how long does it take to do such a job on film like Dune, from the beginning till the final cut?
it should take me a year, but this one, we had a pandemic, so, and also it sort of helped us, the pandemic, because we made the film and it was the plan, and then we needed to pause and actually think and make some changes and revisit the edit, and the pandemic actually, it's terrible to talk about something that was a tragedy for so many people, but for me and for Denny, it was a lifesaver to be able to say, okay, let's stop and think about what we're doing. It's a complicated film, Dune, as you know. It's incredibly complicated to try and establish the Bene Gesserit, the Atreides, the Emperor, the Sardaukar, the Mentats, the spice, space travel, worms, Fremen. I mean, it's an almost impossible task to try and make that a film. And although a lot of those great decisions were made in the script, they, you know, the edit is a final draft of the script, as everybody knows. Once it's living and breathing, it tells you whether it's working or not when you're in the cutting room. And Scorsese had a saying which I really like. Scorsese says a film is never as good as your dailies, and it's never as bad as your first assembly. So that's the issue with Dune 1. So in answer to your question, Dune 1 took me 18 months, and Dune 2 took a year. My assistant stayed longer because with Dune Part 2, Christopher Nolan found some money for an IMAX screening on film, and there was a 70mm version of Dune 2, and that's a really complicated process because the film is shot on digital, and then it's graded, and then it's put on film, and then it's scanned back, and then graded again. So then one more time to go onto film, you're trying to match something that's almost impossible to match with color. So for my assistant, there's also with IMAX, there were 49 reels to check, and they burnt so much film. They lost a huge amount of silver. You know, the cost of silver went up as a result of Dune Part 2. So, you know, everything has to be checked, and especially a film where little delicate things like the blue eyes in a wide shot, if you get the grading wrong on film, then it's lost. So for my assistant, it was about 16 months of work. Okay. But typically for me, a film of this size would be a year.
I want to go still, I will be very practical tonight, very boring maybe, but it really interests me because normally you really can't see or you doesn't know anybody who is so much involved in such a high budget project. So I would like to know how your work as an editor starts on such a project, even during the pre-production process. What does it take? Is it that you are setting up the theme, the work with the script, with the VFX team, all these things I would like to know. What do you do before the shooting?
So, to start at the end, I'm working fully working on the film the day after they start filming. So they start shooting on Monday, I'm editing that on Tuesday as a general principle. And I would have been in Hungary all the time. But leading up to that, there's some processes that I like to be involved with, and Denny asked me to be involved with. The first one, of course, is I read the book. And that I knew about because, you know, Denny's on my sofa all the time, and during Blade Runner he was talking on the phone, and I listened, and I knew that he was going to be working on Dune, so I read the book. And then sometime later a script came, and Denny asks for some feedback. He leaves it quite late to share that with me. But, you know, the editing, there's an impact, and sometimes I'm able to say things quite broadly about it, you know, that it, sometimes, you know, you're reading a script and you feel as though there's one day that is like absurdly long, or there's an endless night, or, you know, there's something that...
Actually, sorry to interrupt you, but you are famous for never starting the film like it was meant, that you always start the film from the middle, then go to the beginning. So can you feel this even when you are reading the script, or is it just a result of dailies or these things?
I think many of the things that I do kind of experimentally are because something isn't working. That's the truth. You find that stuff later. You know, it's, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. And I would say, I don't really feel like that. I'm exaggerating. But there's a little bit like, at some point, we realized that we need to create something inside Timothee's head, that you need to understand what he's seeing and what he's dreaming, and that there was material that was shot that explains what his visions are and how they change. And, you know, this developed even up to, in fact, on the very last day of June 1, they were literally going to take my Avid away. It was the last day of editing after 18 months. And the night before, I'd had a terrible fear that there was all this little dream stuff going on in his head that we were following, and that I didn't have any climax to that. And so there's a bit in the fight at the end of part 1, which was all done on the last day, which was just little moments in the middle of that fight that made everything come together. And I just rang Denny very early in the morning and say, I've got to work today, I won't come to the dub, I need to get this off my chest. And, you know, so sometimes you don't realize things until really late.
So what is your exact daily routine in your editing room?
Just before that, I should say that before the filming starts, Denny's process is this, and it's not untypical for a film with a lot of design and VFX, is that he starts with a script, storyboards, and then sometimes previs, and then sometimes a little bit of pre-shooting, which might be little elements that you might use later in the film, like Ana de Armas in Blade Runner. The first thing we shot was her projections, the little projections, so that's typical. But with Denny in the storyboards, he works with principally with a man called Sam Hudecki, who's a storyboard artist in Toronto. And that is a real conceptual workout, because there's the script and then there's the storyboard. And with the storyboard, they are working out such questions as how do they remove blue piss from a worm? And they have to sit there for a day or two, and Sam and Denny will start sketching to work out how this device extracts piss from a worm.
So these are the first things. You get a script, you get a storyboard with some helping elements for you to imagine. What's the story about?
Yeah,
visually, let's say.
The very first contact I have with that film after I've read the script is normally that Patrice Fermet, who's the production designer, an amazing production designer, he sends me the art Bible. And the art Bible is about 90 pages, and it combines images that they've collected of the sets, of some of the props, the swords, the design of the flags, the uniforms, and they're really beautiful sketches. I mean, they are really, really sensational pieces of art in themselves, and you start to see indications of lighting, of what a sitch looks like. So you're starting to kind of, you know, fill up your head with this image of what you're going to work on maybe in a month. And then previs is, with the storyboards, I look at those about a month as well, a month ahead of filming. And then previs is when there's something really challenging for VFX. They will tend to do a previs. And in fact, previs has really developed. I don't know how many people work in post-production, but you'll know that now it's a really sensationally good animation. And, you know, in the past, it used to be just pieces of a GIF, you know, moving around. But now you've got, people will act the roles, and I'll show you some stuff later. But there's a lot of, with the previs, I'm involved with that, because how long you hold a shot is the difference between $500,000 and $600,000. And if I think that shot is way too long, then I'll show a cut to Denny and say, you know, maybe you don't need this shot and we can remove this shot. Or, you know, it's much better to say that now than in a year's time, because it's so expensive to remove a shot at that point. I will sometimes, with the very big set pieces, I'll even start laying sound effects. And you know, one of the hardest tasks for the editor really is, how long do you hold a shot when it's just a storyboard shot? And it's got to become a discussion document for planning for VFX. And you have to kind of work out, I need to find my way into the sequence, so, and my background is in sound and music, so I'll just start building it up already. And certainly with the previous sequence, I would really build a decent soundtrack that might even be there for a year. So, you know, I'll use everything I can.
How long does it take you to remove these animated sequences before you get the real film, or the real takes? Because this must be a very long time when it just doesn't fit, and it's better to have these scratches.
The scratches stay for a long time because, so the way the shoot was structured was we had several months in Budapest, and we did many battle scenes, and we did some scenes with sand. We did the gladiatorial arena with Fade Routher. We did a whole load of interiors and all of the material in the sitches, inside the sitches. These were all sets in Budapest, and then the production moved on to Jordan and UAE to film desert material. But while that's the main unit, but we also had a fetus unit, which was shooting all the time. We had an aerial unit, which was shooting the plates, some of which are in there. For example, a low-angle shot of the huge wide shot where he's running, that's an aerial shot. And then we also had worm unit, and worm unit was 44 days, I think, 44 days. So that's mostly for the later part of the sequence, which is where Paul Atreides is riding the worm, learning how to ride the worm. And then they shot the last part in UAE, and they had the perfect Dune, and they filmed the Fremen, and they filmed all the individual shots, and they filmed some stunts, and they filmed the crowd cheering, and so really it was, bits of the previs were there for 4 months. And the worm unit was doing, on average, about 2 shots a day.
I have a question for a member of Worm Unit.
Yeah.
Maybe maybe you heard it before, but how do you get off the worm? I've never seen it in the film. They always get on that crazy bus, but they
How do you
never
get
get
off?
out of that. How to get off?
Well, we had to give a reason for you to come back for Dune 3. And
Very good reason.
all will be revealed. To be continued. But no, the Worm Unit was, it was every day they had this bit of worm, like a realistic skin of worm on a construction on a gimbal, and they had the camera, and then it was surrounded by a giant collar. And they don't use green screens on Dune. They develop sand screens. They figured that you can use the reverse of green and find something that doesn't reflect green on the skin or on the visor. They didn't want green screen, so they use a kind of sand-colored screen all around. And basically, there's a guy called Gert Nevsa, I think his name is. I don't want to get his name wrong, but he really has the best job in all of... some of us think we have a great job in cinema, but Gert really has the best job, which he gets to blow things up and throw shit at actors. And he spent like 44 days hurling several tons of dust and sand at the actors. And but there was a collar, that means that he can tidy it up at the end of each night. But it was basically wind machines throwing soot and dust and wind at the actors, and it was all worked out shot by shot. What's interesting is you see the differences as well from the previs. Denny always has a saying, which is there's the script, but more, what is the boss, on set? There's the script, and then there's the storyboards, and then there's the previs, and then there's nature. So if they go somewhere and it occurs to them that there's a better idea, they'll always follow that. And often, Greg Fraser, the cinematographer, he will change something because of the light. It's better that the two characters are swapped round. One's on the left, is now on the right. So everything is evolving all the time, and nature always wins over the plan. The plan is good to get you there, but actually they change things all the time. And in that one, you can see, for example, when you first see the worm moving around, there was a detail shot. It started very wide, and it went into a detail shot. But you can see in the finished film, they actually chose not to do that. It was better to try and capture the whole thing in one. They felt on set very clearly there's more tension to having a wide shot and to feel some kind of animal face-off, more like a hunt, between a man and a worm. So, and that there was some tension in the worm just disappearing, and you're lost a little bit, and he's lost, and you can feel it. It's better to try and do that all in one shot. So, the previs was thrown away on the day of the shoot, and the plan changes all the time.
And still, with the VFX, I maybe can't imagine how do you work with the rhythm of the whole movie, with everything when so many things are just not ready. Do you edit first the scenes where are the actors, just let's say normal scenes with close-ups and the normal dialogue scenes, and the action scenes come later, and then you started to do the whole rhythm, or how do you work exactly on that? Because I can't imagine.
I mean, there are different scenes require different solutions, and you'd be surprised sometimes, that me and Denny can spend a whole year working on a dialogue scene, because there's so much nuance, and there's so much little changes we want to make all the time, and it settles into a new pattern, and then we come back, it's not quite right, and the context changes. And then there are other scenes where it's really the same as the day or the week after they shot it. At the end of Dune Part 2, there's a fight between Paul and Fade, and I swear to you, it's not different from the first time I cut it. And that's, you know, it's like an amazing compliment to an editor when a director says, it's working exactly the way I like it, I don't want to change anything. And he's very wise in a way, because he concentrates on the effort that you need to make. But you asked, how do you anticipate, I guess?
Yeah, how do you handle with this situation when there's so many shots, so many takes that are just not seen, with the emotions of actors and all those things?
My way in always as an editor is sound, and I think sound helps me. Even that little scene that we showed at the beginning with the little hypnotism, it was the sound that actually opened the door for me for that scene, because it wasn't exactly as planned. They shot some things around the room, they shot the chandeliers, they shot the grandfather, they shot the images of the bull, and all of these things were good things to sort of include, because the grandfather, we don't go into the history of the Atreides, but there is something a little bit like, should we say, something bloody-minded about the Atreides. Do you know what I mean by that? That they will stand in front of danger. It's a little bit like, I will say, as a matter of pride for a British person, it's a bit like the plucky British facing the invasion of Britain in 1939. You know, it's that little, it's an act of bravery, but it's also slightly psychotic, I would say. You know, there's bravado and then there's psychotic. But there we are. So we wanted to include all those things, but it was not clear, and I thought that they would be very useful, not only as introductions. It's good to see that little bullfighter. It tells the story for the people who know the book that the grandfather of the Atreides died in a bullfight. It acknowledges that story that people who know the book would know. But also, it's a good measurement when Paul is looking at the very same thing and wondering whether his father's bravery to come to this hostile landscape where he's going to die, and he kind of knows it. There's a little bit that, oh my God, we got some young company.
Some young fan.
Or maybe it's somebody just crying because they're bored. So how to say, I used the sound was my way in. I found some sound of the little tinkly bells, and it helped me time the scene, and it was really useful key to say, you can cut to these things and express that there's something weird about to happen. You know, there's a little tension to it. So sound is a really good way to play. There's a little clip, actually. There's a clip that shows you when you've got no way to time things, there's no shot, there's not even a storyboard. What do you do? And I included a clip which is sort of about about a month after filming finished. We realized in Dune Part 1 that there's a scene where you see a harvester, and there's a thing called a carryall. Those that know the film well, it's the little machine that lifts the harvester and drops it somewhere else. And it means that they can harvest spice, and then when the worm comes, they can just lift it and take it out. And we had a sequence where, you know, the carryall comes and it can't work. There's something wrong. And you don't know whether it's because it's bad equipment or whether it's sabotage, maybe. And we realized that it would make a lot more sense if you saw a carry-all before and that you saw how it works, how it's meant to work. So we had this idea, and also it was useful to have a little break from dialogue, a little break from the drama, and to have a bit of what Denny calls sci-fi shit. So what do I do in the cutting room? I've got a sound team who's already working, and they're saying, well, what's it going to be like? We don't know what it's going to be like. We've got 6 weeks before we're dubbing, and we need to develop the sound. And the VFX are saying, well, how long are you thinking? Is it like 3 seconds or 10 seconds? Tell us what the animation is like. And I have to have something in the cut, so let's show the next clip. I'll show you how we solve this problem. The reason why there's a shot of a helicopter in there is that you may not know that in Dune, all of the ornithopters are originally real shots of helicopters. So everything that you see is kind of based on a reality. And that means that I included that shot because I knew that they could study the way that the helicopter lifts off, and that you can see how the sand is moving on the floor. It's a kind of good guide. They even can use elements of it. And in fact, the helicopters have got lots of, red dots that they can scan so that they can see how this object is moving in the sky. They call it proxy shooting. And, as far as possible, everything in Dune is based on something real. There's always something real. And even some bits of the worm are real, as far as it can be.
I remember you said that's real. That's what made the difference between sci-fi of Denis Villeneuve and the films like by Marvel. That there's still the difference between the budget and the attitude to those films. Can you describe the difference?
Well, the big difference is really for the actors, because a lot of the time, the action films and superhero films are shot in green screens, and or in the volume or something, is getting closer to giving the actors a feeling of what it's like. And it's very impactful. I can remember when I started as an assistant editor in the 80s, and I went on set to have a look at them filming, and I talked to the production designer of a production that was made. It was called The Singing Detective, and there was a scene inside a house, and they were going to film a few things there. And they built the house inside the studio. They built Hammersmith Bridge outside the house, and it looked super impressive. It was like a 1 in 10 scale of the house. And I remember as an assistant, I was just there for looking in the morning, and at one point I opened all the drawers, and every single drawer had shirts in and socks, and somebody really thought about the character that lived in the house. And it's a little bit like, what can the filmmakers do to make the experience of acting in that space as real as it possibly can be, as full, as loaded, and as an experience as it can be. So I suppose it's a little bit like that. Whereas I feel like, a lot of, I won't just say Marvel films, but there are a lot of films that are shot in green screens, and there's like, whoa, somebody just reacting like that, and it's not the same as when you're standing on a dune and looking into the far distance. With Arrival, a lot of the time it was somebody in
green lycra costume holding a tennis ball above their head. And it was like a little miracle sometimes that Amy Adams could act.
Maybe we could talk a bit about a complication, about a complicated process in the editing room with the timeline and with the editing program, which is, I think, kind of impressive. Would you please screen for us the JPEG of timeline? Joe, would you please briefly describe it? I don't know if it's possible to get into this thing. Maybe you can also describe for us then how big is your team, and then we can really see why is it so, and who is necessary for you to make one single edit. I can't imagine that I make an edit in that and not to be completely lost.
Well, okay. So first of all, I'll explain the size of the team. And I'm not very typical for Hollywood because normally there's more than one editor, but it's not our preference to work like that. It's very typical in Hollywood to have 2 or 3 editors working together, and each has their assistant.
Why?
To share.
Who does have the responsibility then?
You both do. I don't like it.
They pay the coins.
Well, sometimes, like, for example, there's a certain film that I do know, which was where one editor did the dramatic scenes and the other editor did the action scenes. And then I know another film where they just say, okay, you do reels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'll do reels 5, 6, 7, and 8. And to me, it's not the way I like to work. I suppose also it depends on the director's style. Some directors like to shoot a lot of stuff. And Denny always tells his camera team that he doesn't want coverage, he wants snipers, that have to wait and get their shot and just get their shot, and they don't shoot lots and lots of material. It's true that there's a lot of material tends to come from second unit and from aerial unit. They just, they're there only for 2 days in the desert with a couple of helicopters and 2 camera crews maybe, so they grab a lot of stuff and they do. It's better to keep filming, keep filming. They're there for such a short time. But main unit is very economical, so Denny does make it possible for me to be the only editor. And that's because in a typical day, I'll get an hour and a half or 2 hours of material from main unit, and maybe an hour from fetus unit, and half an hour from worm unit, and on some days I'll get more material from other units that are coming into play, sometimes VFX. So it's believe it or not, it's manageable. I've worked with directors who do 5.5 hours of dailies every day, and that's impossible. It's impossible to view everything and cut everything in one day to be ready the next day for the next 5.5 hours to fall on you. And for that, you need more than one editor. It's a directorial style. And with Denny, I'm just on the edge of what's possible to cut in one day. And I do have the benefit of a really good first assistant who wants to kill me and be the editor of Dune 4. So he's practicing and he wants to learn, and I'm able to kind of, I can concentrate for a whole week on cutting the Fade and Paul fight. And while the new scenes are coming in, I can look at them and I hand some of them to him to cut, and between the two of us, we can cover the whole film. So to explain my team, I've got myself, I've got first assistant. In this film, it was Chris Voutsinas, who's a brilliant first. He's been working for about 12 years.
I've known him, I worked with him 12 years ago, in fact, and then I brought him back on Dune 2, and he's done with me Dune 2 and The Creator and some other small films and adverts and things like that. He has his own assistant. In Hungary, we had a local Hungarian who's somebody who's worked with me 3 times, who's brilliant as well, called Mercedes, and Mercedes Janka, and she's a local Hungarian. She's also a kind of internet influencer, and she was on the equivalent of Big Brother in Hungary. So she's more famous than any of us, and but she also, as a second assistant, her job is to prepare the dailies every day. That's her big job. So she's making things are in sync, that everything is received from the lab, that everything is applied with the proper LUT, that it's organized in a bin. And this enables Chris to be able to kind of share the load with me of either cutting or doing a little bit. Chris is very good with sound too. So I would sometimes work on a scene and give it to him to work on the sound. Then Mercedes we had a PA who brought our, was really in charge of photocopying and getting lunch and, but I gave her a few tasks because she also wants to be an editor. So there was a little, I gave her a few little projects, and she was very keen, particularly to show the other assistants how much better she was than them. So that was also kind of a good thing to foster. So that's editorial. There's me, first assistant, second assistant, and PA. Then there's working alongside me is a VFX editor, in this case, Eddie Garcia, who's worked on Dune 1 as an assistant, and we promoted him. And he's worked on Marvel films, and he's worked on a lot of things. And his job is a bridge between editorial and the VFX department. He answers to us in editorial, so he will represent us in discussions where I'm not present. And that just means, he's sometimes there just to explain why I've put this shot in there rather than there, and he can say, this needs to change. He can guide the artists working in VFX a little bit to try and where things change, okay? And he had an assistant who, again, was a local Hungarian. And they worked together in Hungary. So we're all working together in Origo Studios throughout the shoot. Then when we finish the shoot, we go down, shrink a little bit, and it just becomes me, Chris, a new second assistant who is Los Angeles based, Dylan, and then Eddie, the VFX, so 4 in editorial. But soon after that, sound department starts, and that's a different department from editing, but we're part of post-production. But that's a huge team of people who, in this case, it started in New Zealand and ended up coming back to Los Angeles. And I think there were about 20 people on that team in New Zealand. And they are developing sounds all the time. In fact, we started a little bit during the shoot. There are some things that were already done on Dune 1, but for example, there was a new harvester, a Harkonnen harvester that had to be designed. And they would start, you can't go to a sound effects library and say, I need a baby worm piss machine. It's like you really have to kind of build every single item and be ready with multiple versions to play to me and Denny and to develop. And this film, the challenge with sound is that everything is loud. So you have to kind of make character, and you also have to kind of work out where is music going to go and where is sound effects going to go, and not to do it all at the same time, right? Not to, you can't beat Hans Zimmer anyway. It's like he will come with his Panzer division and run you over with his huge Teutonic army,
And sorry, I'm being very racist, aren't I? Do you think? Sorry. Anyway, I love Hans and his vastly, absurdly Teutonic army, but it's you don't want to fight.
We will talk about Hans still later. I think about it when we talk about music.
We'll come back to Hans. But you're starting to design how all these worlds live together. So the other main ingredient that adds to the editorial department is a music editor. And I've worked with Clint Bennett, who's a fantastic music editor. He's very busy, and he's done Arrival, Blade Runner, Dune 1, Dune 2, and some other films. He worked on Widows for me too. So he's also working and starting to build music. Although I've got to say, I don't use music for as long as I possibly can. It's really important to me and Denny that we don't put any music in for like 8 weeks. And the idea is, I would say this, if you put John Williams on your sequence, pretty much everybody at some point in their career is going to put John Williams on their film. And it could be a very bad film, but John Williams is great. And, you have to kind of work out, what are people excited and tense about? Is it your film or is it John Williams? And 99% of the time, it's John Williams, okay? So you need to avoid that. I've been to so many screenings with the same temp tracks, and they're very deceptive. And if you remove them, it's like the best workout. It's like liposuction for your story. It's like the ultimate treadmill for storytelling. And also it gives you a chance to try and really develop the sound. To say, do we really need music at all in this scene? Can we do this with sound design? Can we just give the ear a break from music? Do we need the hand being held by music all the time? No, let's see if we can design. Most of the beginning of that worm sequence is just that pulse, and the sound of the worm. And, it's a good tension device not to have music, music, in my view, sometimes comforts the audience. There's a sense that you're on a train, that there's a comfort in that. Whereas sometimes with sound effects, or even better, with silence, there's a tension because you don't know where it's going to go. Sorry.
No, but is your team, or at least the top of that, also part of the creative process when you are stuck somehow during the editing process? Because sometimes you need to improvise, even in those high budget projects. You have to think some difficult situations through. So then. You solve those things just with Dennis, or is your team part of that solution as well?
On the smallest level, sometimes this is the smallest level in which having a creative team is helpful, is the fact that this sounds awful, really, but sometimes you work for like several days on a scene and you want to show it to somebody, and then you ask somebody to, I'll call Chris or Mercedes and say, will you come and have a look at this scene? I want to show you the scene. And then you play the scene, and then you look at it and you go away. I know exactly what's wrong with it. And it's something I didn't know was wrong before they watched it with me. Does that make sense? And it feels terribly abusive. But it's genuinely the thing of having an audience with you. And this is the beginning of a process where I think the most important ingredient in editing a film is showing it to people and feeling, understanding, how does it play? How are people reading it? What questions are they asking? When, you're with a story, I think you sort of want to be in parallel with the audience or ahead.
you must never be behind. If an audience is making up a better ending than you, then you're dead, you know? So it's like really vital to know exactly what you're communicating to an audience. And we really learnt that with Arrival was a complicated structure. I don't think it doesn't matter if I spoil Arrival, does it? I mean, maybe you've seen it, and if you haven't, why haven't you seen it? And but there's, you know, a trick that's played that at the beginning of the film, you see something that hasn't happened yet. But when you see it at the beginning, you think it's in the past. It's not, it's in the future. So as somebody very elegantly put it, it's an epilogue masquerading as a prologue. But the trouble is that we've all seen 100 years worth of cinema, and the biggest danger is that if you build that wall too solidly, it's really hard to kick it down later in the film. And for the longest time, we started screening it to family and friends, and we realized that we were not successfully explaining that simple thing, that hadn't happened yet, and that we had to do more work to make it clearer, to be less obscure. And a really valuable lesson was we showed it to a friend in Montreal. She's an amazing editor who was the very first woman editor of Bond, and she was the very first non-linear editor of Bond. She's amazing. And she watched the film, and she had an interpretation of the ending that is completely different to what was intended. And she was right to make up her own ending, to make up her own explanation. And we realized, you know, that feedback taught us that we have to work harder to explain that this child isn't born yet. And we even said it, you know, there's even a, you know, the good thing about a logogram, if people know what a logogram is you can put any subtitle you like on a logogram. And I think we basically put a subtitle on a logogram that says, you're seeing the future, you know. And then me and Denny ran away, you know, will it work? But no, you have to test it. And it's a way of keeping fresh. So I'm sorry, it's a very long answer to a short question, but with a timeline as big as that timeline, it's impossible to make, you know, a little cut. You know, one cut can take 10 minutes of going to the left of this one, left of this one, left of that one, right of this one, right, left, right, left, right, left. And I tend to, in the later stages where it's as busy as that, I'll just cut things in chunks, and sometimes I'll fix it, and sometimes I'll pass it to Chris to say, help, you know, the sound is horrible, bumpy. But sometimes, I have to say with Denny, a special feature of our editing is sometimes, despite our love of sound, despite our love of Hans Zimmer and his Teutonic Army, we also cut the film in complete silence, and even dialogue scenes, I just turn the speakers off. And if it works as a silent movie, I think it's a good sign that it's going to work. So,
isn't silence the best tension tool that you have?
I mean, yes. I think there's an idea that, you know, particularly if you're working with a longer film, and this film is 2 hours, 45, I think, so it's a long film. But, you know, how do you keep surprise, and how do you keep the audience engaged? And, you know, the last thing you want to feel when you're sitting in an audience is people just sort of sinking back, you know? It's like they may be enjoying it, but it's like there isn't that active engagement, you know, active engagement with it. And I think you get some of that, you retain some of that by just being able to kind of surprise a little bit. And that can sometimes, like in the first clip, you know, we just cut all the noise of a giant kind of Harkonnen ornithopter blowing up to Zendaya going and her footsteps. There was nothing else. You know, sorry, that was a bad imitation. So, but it was paring it down to the smallest. Look how many tracks we can play in the cutting room, and look how many thousands more you can play in the dubbing theatre. And we just went down to one. You know, just to A1, for those who know timelines, it was just A1. So it's kind of, it's that sudden contrast, obviously just, I think they're exciting, and it's part of management of the kind of whole soundtrack. And although this is a collaboration with the sound editors, Richard King, and the sound mixers, Doug and Ron, and a big collaboration, of course, with our music editor and Hans Zimmer and his team. It's like but editorial has a very strong role in trying to kind of harmonize all of this, because otherwise you end up in a horrible fight and everything is a noise, and the ear gets tired and the audience gets tired. There's a new film that did quite well in the States called Civil War, and not cut by me, but it was Jake Roberts was the editor, and they made some decision in the cutting room that they would there's a lot of gunfights in it, and that they would just stop completely the sound on a still image and then carry on. And it's amazing how breaking up an action sequence keeps it surprising and keeps the audience attention very, very strongly. And I guess the third clip it's by way of saying, what is the hardest possible cut? And to me, the hardest possible cut is an aerial shot of a desert with Hans Zimmer's music on it. And, you know, I was always taught by my editor teachers and mentors, you know, don't ever cut on the beat. And I say, fuck that. Cut on the beat. It's exhilarating to have Hans Zimmer and a hard cut. You know, I live and dream.
Great excuse to talk about Hans. So, how was the cooperation with him? It wasn't the first one for sure. You have known each other for a long time. What makes him so extraordinary? You said something about how quick he can be, how overwhelming he can be. So tell us, please, all those very interesting things.
I knew Hans from 1988. So I was a rookie sound editor, and I worked on I was doing the sound editing for a film about a half man, half gorilla. And it was really successful. It was really successful, and not in small part because of Hans Zimmer. He wrote a really great score that dramatized a sort of almost impossible concept into something that you could understand. You know, that it was about a scientist who, I could go on a lot, but it was a really great score. I do remember going round to his studio, and it was at the end of a long day, and he'd been recording strings in this tiny little theatre. It was a place called Lily Yard in Chelsea in London. And I went round there, and he'd had all these string players, and they were all squeezed together, and it was this absurdly virtuosic score with the string players playing all this fast music. And he played me the music, which was amazing, but he played it so loud that the television was between the speakers and the television was distorting. So I couldn't actually see the picture, and they didn't care about the picture. It was just this huge score. And he finished the job, and I remember somebody at the BBC, he literally finished our job and went to Hollywood the next day on a plane. And I think it was Driving Miss Daisy, or he got a gig in LA. And I remember the guy at the BBC said, you know, Hans, you know, he overspent. The string sessions went over £390, and he's never going to work for the BBC again. Yeah. So.
And has he?
He was doing Richard Attenborough's latest, right? So the way that Hans works is really interesting. I mean, I think it's although he comes from a kind of rock band, you know, he was in, you know, Buggles, and he wrote commercials, and he was like one of the first people with a Fairlight synthesizer, and you know, he comes from a kind of rock instinct, and the way that the music's written has got a lot of that, and it's not a surprise to me that he's now doing amazing sell-out tours with 100,000 people coming to his concerts all around Europe and the world. So he's a rocker, but there's also a little bit of him that's like, you know, the German composers of old, the Beethovens, and I've seen that work. The way that he tends to work is, for Dune in particular, I can talk about a lot, is he spends a long time developing instruments and things that can be played on a keyboard, but so he recorded, he knew very early on, and Denny had asked that women's vocals was a strong part of Dune, and it was the whole Bene Gesserit concept. Denny had come up with this idea that, you know, this idea of the Bene Gesserit training, that you receive the knowledge of all previous Bene Gesserit generations, that in some way inside the Bene Gesserit is these voices of the old nasty grannies, you know, and Hans recorded hundreds of little samples of some singers, some Hungarian singers, in fact, and it's all playable. You know, he can press a keyboard and it goes, and so on. So he builds playable instruments, and that can take months. He even commissioned sort of musical sculptures, things that, like a sound sculpture. There's a sound in Dune that is a physical object that's moving, which sounds kind of high and shrill and sandy. And I can't really explain it, but it was built by a specialist. And then there's a woodwind guy he goes to Home Depot a lot and buys bits of plastic tubing. And anyway, so there's a whole army of people that are preparing the soundtrack before a note has been written. And then when he comes to talking about themes, you know, he knows the Dune book very well. He read it when he was a kid, and he loved it. And, you know, when you really get to it, pretty much everybody is sort of related to everybody else in one way or another. And so musically, he builds these little bricks that stick together, and he'll spend a long time working on the motif. And this is where it's quite similar to somebody like Beethoven, in my view. You know, the Beethoven writes dun 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 dun, and then, you know, can develop that little organic nodule, a little organic cell into a vast structure by inventiveness and contrast and harmony and all sorts of tricks. And Hans is doing the same. He's trying to find things. I'm allowed to swear. Have I sworn already? I'll tell you a story. There was one time when I saw Hans working on a little piece of music, and, you know, he was kind of noodling. He was trying to find something. It was to do with the Atreides theme. And, you know, there's a lot of people. It's like a guy on a keyboard, and there's this audience here, and we're all like, you know, completely silent while the master is trying to work something out. And it felt like it was going on for quite a long time. And I said, Hans, right now, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for a musical idea with the efficiency of the word fuck. So I was trying to figure it out, and I realized, you know, yeah, it's true. Fuck it's a word that, you know, you can use it in many different contexts, right? You can say, I fucking love you, and you can say, I fucking hate you. It works as strong in both instances. It's international. everybody, no matter what their race or tribe, understands the word. You know, people in the Amazonian jungle understand the word fuck. Everybody says the word fuck. Nuns who have strokes have been found to 70% of the time say the word fuck. So it's
We have
universal.
to look at some Beethoven pieces if there's no some Scheiße in there or something. In some of his compositions, there should be for sure.
But it's something, it's a connective tissue. You understand he wants a sticky idea that fits. It could be love music, it's adaptable. It could be love music or it could be war music. In fact, in Dune 2, the big so-called romantic theme, the first time you hear it, it's a version of something that you heard. It's a war theme played on bagpipes. So it's the same little kernel, it's the same little organic thing, and that's why I kind of, you know, it's a real privilege to be able to see this develop from these little bricks that he can work with arrangers and, you know, he arranges himself, and all together they take little things and they take this little ingredient and they can build it into music that works against the film. So, I mean, he's a master.
I don't know if I'm right, but it's like that he really composed all those themes and music without knowing a piece of a film, without knowing any material, or
it's not entirely true.
He was preparing some sounds and instruments and everything, and then he saw the rough cut and he started to put the music together. Or how was it? Or at which stage he came into the process? Sorry.
Well, he would. I think we showed him the film at a fairly early stage. I'd say about 6 weeks into the fine cut. Already by then, there's been discussions, and he was developing the sound world, and we have to do test screenings. We have to show the first of all the normal thing. This is an agreement with the Directors Guild that the director gets 10 weeks with the editor to make a director's cut. It's 10 weeks, only 10 weeks, which is, it's crazy when you think about how much has to be in that cut.
And when is the first moment when the director come to the editing room?
Normally, you know, basically you finish shooting on a Friday, and then I'll move the cutting room back to Los Angeles. I cut both Dune and Dune 2 in my home, and it took a couple of days to set up the equipment and for me to travel, and then Denny would relax somewhere for a few days, maybe a week. So I have a week to do the so-called editor's cut, which doesn't mean anything. It's not the finished cut. It's an assembly, and then I'll screen it to Denny maybe at the end of that week, and then we don't talk for a little bit, and and then, you know, he has a good weekend and acclimatizes himself back to, you know, a cooler temperature than Jordan. And then we start, you know, strong coffee on Monday morning, 9 o'clock, we cut. And then 10 weeks later, that's the deadline to show it to the producers. And then after that, you know, that can either take a short time or it can take a long time. With Dune 2, it was a very short time before we were expected to show it to a test audience. And that would typically be 500 people. And that's with questionnaires, electronic questionnaires nowadays. And they're looking at it as a marketing exercise. You know, they talk about quadrants. So they talk about, it's basically young men, young women, older women, and they're looking at, and there's now, you know, other categories that they include, and the idea is they're looking at how does the film track it on those main 4 quadrants, and what can they do to recommend changes to the story that are going to help attract the quadrants they like. There are some films that track badly in one quadrant that they thought would track very well, and maybe they'll ask you to try and analyze the story in ways that will broaden the appeal of the film. So it's a marketing exercise. But for us, it's also a kind of chance to be with a real audience that doesn't know anything about it and interpret how the film played. We will always change the film after that many times.
How is it with the producers and their press on director? I can imagine that it's always like that. At the end of the editing process, it's very risky situation, and also at certain point the film can be really fragile. How do you solve those problems or some conflicts, potential conflicts with producers and everything? Who's got a final word, and how is it, for example, in the case of such a film? Or were there any strong discussions about certain points in the film, for example, in Dune Part 1?
I mean, in a way, we're screening, whether it's to close friends and family, before we show it to the producers. So, and the way I kind of mark things up in the Avid is that they go up a number every time I screen it publicly, so-called publicly. So any screening, you know, proper screening where we prepare the screening, get it ready, and then as close as possible to a cinema experience for, even if it's just up to one of our friends or to a gang of Denny's friends or whatever. Each time I'll go up, and then you have the producer screening. So that normally takes place around 12th fine cut. 10th or 11th or 12th fine cut. This is on average over about 5 films, I would say. And then until we get to a finished cut, on the last few films, it's about 21 fine cuts. That means that the film has been screened 21 times before we've said, that's it, it's finished. Arrival was a good, interesting one because that took much longer than we thought it would take. There was a few problems with the story. It was always good, but it was like not perfect for the longest time. And I think that went on to 25 fine cuts.
You and Denis Villeneuve, you are known that you're really very much sympathetic to each other, and you cooperate really strongly. You got the same feeling for the music, for the sound, for the visual things. Did you have any time strong fight about anything?
I hate to disappoint you. Probably no.
You disappointed me.
I disappointed you. We have a huge, maybe we confine all of our disagreements to lunch and what we should have. I always like lots of carbohydrates, and he likes lots of salad and vegetables.
Okay. That's transmission, psychological transmission into the food.
I don't know how it is. I don't know. I'm just really blessed. I mean, you know, a journalist asked me, was doing an article about this idea of how much practice do you need to be a so-called expert, and there was always this thing about 10,000 hours. People talk about having 10,000 hours of experience as a violinist or as a conductor, and I've figured out that I've done 128,000 hours. And right at the end of that 128,000, I found 2 directors that I would die to work with again. You know, they're just so, it's been such a good experience. And mostly because there's a trust. And there's an old, if I'm being honest with you, there's an old Joe that would, you know, somebody would ask you to do something and you go, in your head, you're going, that's not going to work. It's just because of this, because of that, you know, it just doesn't work. And, you know, the grumpy editor inside me is like, you know, it's not going to work. Whereas with Denny, you know, because we've said that thing like, how do you solve this problem? We identify a problem. It takes a long time sometimes to work out what is the problem. And then when you've identified it, you're saying, well, you know, why don't we try this? And there's, with him, because I've stepped, you know, into the darkness
so many times of not knowing whether it will work, and it has worked. Even if it hasn't worked, we've found something that does. You know, we don't solve it immediately, but some other thing, it opens a door to finding what the solution is. So I would will that for everybody, you know, in this audience who's maybe an editor who is, you know, it's always easy to say, well, it's not going to work, you know, but you want to work with somebody where you trust that if it doesn't work, they aren't going to insist that you keep it and it makes you look bad or anybody look bad. Denny's very protective about all of his cast, all of his crew, and very protective of the standard that we all share. But you also, you know, in return, the gift I can give him there is that you go, yeah, let's try it. Let's see. We know what that looks like. This is non-linear editing. We can try anything. And that's the spirit that I've, you know, really at the end of 128,000 hours of work, I've earned somehow the luck to live with somebody that, to live and work with somebody that, where there's that trust.
I have one more question. What happens quite often, and it's really trouble with the editing process, is that you just somehow lose the sensitivity to your project because you just saw it so many times, you just don't see it as it is. How do you rebuild or this fresh eyes which you can see the material and which you can see the film? Do you have any tricks how to look at the film as you saw it for the first time?
You know, the real problem with an edit is the later you get, it's a bit like a favorite song, you know, which is like when you know a song really well, then there's something in the brain that it's all about anticipating something, and that, you know, you're re-experiencing something rather than experiencing. But the trouble with cinema is you get one go. You know, you show it to a film audience and you can't expect people to, you know, come back to the cinema again to try and explain the things they didn't understand before. If you didn't grab them, then you've failed in a way. I know that I love films with mystery and I love films with ambiguity, but actually, you know, let's think of David Lynch, Eraserhead, for example. You know, it's very clear. It's really clear storytelling. It's not ambiguous. What it opens your mind into is very big, and it will open a door into thinking imaginatively about a lot of things that you can imagine that make this universe work. But he communicates very clearly, even though it's mysterious in some way. You can come out of the cinema and you can say, well, this happened, that happened, this happened, and it's not, you know, controversial. So, you know, you have to try and keep fresh in the edit, and the difficulty is after a year, this is hard, and the only tips that I would say is, first of all, when you can, have a break. So have a weekend, try and, you know, rest, try and sleep well, try and eat well, try and walk and experience as much life that isn't the film for a day at least, and then come back on Monday and have your screening on Monday at 9 o'clock, strong coffee, watch the film. That gives you some distance. The other things I mentioned earlier, maybe cutting without sound. You know, there are sections of the edit where you can start trying out music, and that changes the film and how you appreciate it. The other trick I've got is sometimes it's good to watch the film in black and white if it's a color film. I've done that. That, you know, it just is.
The DOP would be
horrified.
Would be
actually,
yes.
For some bits,
you'll be so glad.
For the infrared sequences of Blade Runner for Dune, it wouldn't really make much difference. You know, with fade is black and white all the time anyway. So I don't know. But the other one is to flop it. I've done that a few times. So you take the image and you turn it round. It's just one layer on Avid. You just put a flop, I think it's called, and you watch. It's just,
it's just a new experience. It's conning the brain a little bit that you're seeing it for the first time. So you can kind of stay fresh. And always the best advice I can give you is watch the film with somebody who hasn't seen it before. Because even if they don't say anything, you know that you're sweating a little bit during this sequence. It's a sign that you're worried it's not going to work, and that you can sometimes, you know, it makes you want to make a change. So,
so why did you pick up this preview, this clip for us?
there was like, I wanted to, you know, it's partly to show you like a strategy of trying to keep the audience's attention. You know, there's a jump cut in there. You know, in fact, for those who are really hardcore editing members of the audience, there's a cut across the line. How do you say that in Czech when you're crossing the line? So, you know, he goes, just at the point where...
Did you break the 180 rule?
We broke the 180 rule just on that. So it's a little, it amplifies the shock a little bit. But also I wanted to say, like, this is the joy in a big VFX film, is actually, it's just two really good actors. And Timothée has so little to say, but he adds so much, these little expressions and the timing. That's real fun as an editor, is to play with that timing, to try and, you know, to kind of, you know, it just made it funny.
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the most impressive moment about this scene is that the character that Javier Bardem plays is all the time in the film very, very serious, very faithful man, very yeah, very serious. So, and suddenly there are little doubts about if everything is so serious about him, and he got some certain sense of humor. It's really like enlightens his
He's
whole
like a
character.
kind of dangerous father figure as well, isn't he? You know, there's, I mean, there's a bit of improvisation in another scene where, you know, Denny suddenly realized that he needed some scene to break sort of in between this scene and the one before. The scene before, you know, his mother had taken the poison and was nearly dead, and it needed a little sort of lightening of the scene. And they improvised a scene with Stilgar saying to his Fremen, you see, he denies that he's the Messiah, which proves he's the Messiah, you know, as it is written, you know. And but that was just like a little, I mean, you know.
I'm very sorry, but maybe it's not polite, but it reminded me the scene from the Life of Brian, this scene, because there's exactly this scene. He's not I'm not Messiah. Then there's the next scene, and he says, you know, he's not. He says he's not Messiah, so he is a Messiah.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it was. I thought
the Life of Brian is, you know, how many films can you make in a desert without watching Lawrence of Arabia and Life of Brian? Yeah. But, you know, also, just here's a little Easter egg. This is irrelevant to everything we've talked about, but here's how important sound is. There's a moment where Stilgar, in that scene, pretends to be the jinn, and he says, or something. And I took that and I slowed it down by 100 times and put it into this amazing little piece of software called Metasynth. And in the next scene, when he's in the desert, you can hear, it's Stilgar. So it's like, it's just always to try and, I don't know, just think in terms of sound. I just love doing that. Yeah, thank you.
And how is it for the actors and for you to work with this artificial language that they all talk? This Fremens and
Chakopsa.
Yeah. How it must be like really difficult to know what they are saying and how they are saying and where are exact emotions in that, and also where to cut. Do you understand Fremens?
I'm fluently. I mean, there is a very serious guy who's written everything in Chakobsa, and there's some really inventive things. Like there's a bit where I can't remember the word she says, but Zendaya says a word at one point saying, I can't remember, shishakli or something, and it's very quick. And the translation is, you're insane. But actually, in Chakobsa, it means you eat sand. So it's like he's really developed not just a kind of language that sounds real and consistent, but it's, metaphorical, symbolical, all the things that language can be, playful. It's a really hardcore thing. The only thing I would say is that only one person is allowed to ad-lib, and that's Stilgar. He just made the language himself, so there are times where I don't know what he's saying. Nobody knows what he's saying. It's Javier Bardem. He can say whatever he likes. But everybody else was really learned everything. And there's some long scenes. Paul Atreides has some long dialogue in Chakobsa.
But as you said about all your inventions in sound editing and this creativity that you put into editing through the sound, it's like that. Dennis gives you lots of freedom in that. Am I right?
I think it's a collaboration, right? But the editing is the still point of the turning world. So we were talking about collaborating with Hans, and I didn't get to say that in the early stages, he would write a suite of music, like 15 minutes of music, and it's completely independent of film. He's not writing to a piece of film, he's writing to his ideas. And it's kind of very free, and it's a very rich, like an overture almost. It's a bit like like the old-fashioned overture at the beginning of an opera or an operetta. It plays you the main themes. And he's very generous. He can give all of the music to us as the finished music, that's the full mix, but also like 20 tracks that are what he calls food groups. All the percussion, all the keyboards, all the wind instruments, all the vocals, all the blah, blah, blah. And that gives me the freedom at the beginning to try pieces of music out against the film and go, okay, that could work with this, that could work with that. And we start building the soundtrack together. Not always. Sometimes Hans is like the first fully polished piece of music he ever wrote was the last piece in Dune 1, which is where Chani says, this is just the beginning. And it's the kind of climax of part one. And I think for Hans, it was a way of saying, that's where we've got to get to identify that's the goal at the end of the film. And it was, that was the first piece he did. That was definitely scored against picture. But many of the pieces were little discoveries that we made going, that works with this theme, this goes well with the Bene Gesserit, this goes well with the Atreides, and we found it together.
You said Hans Zimmer is extremely fast, that he's the fastest composer in Hollywood.
Wow, it's true. I mean, it's also how, he really does have an army of people who are working, and arrangers that work with him very closely. And, the truth is, no composer who's as busy as Hans is can write 2 hours and 40 minutes of music in 6 weeks. But as a collective, and he supervises to a ridiculous micro level every single second of the music. So it really is incredible to see the whole thing. Sort of things take a long time to take shape and to come into focus, and then in 6 weeks, boom, done. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time for our audience. The question is that Dune 1 and Dune 2 as well are very long, and some people from the audience or some audience find it too long. So And it's nowadays the influence of all the social media and everything is very short and brief. And how do you look at this situation and this pressure that goes for the filmmakers from this perspective?
I mean, look, you know, I'm very aware of that, and thank you for that question. And of course, you know, the weirdest thing is that as an editor, I've become aware of the paradox of length, which is sometimes a shorter film is more boring than a longer film. You know, and in the case of Dune 1, the original director's cut was shorter than the finished film. So there was, you know, we felt like we needed to establish the characters better at the beginning, and that we needed to spend more time with them and to kind of set up the story. And honestly, you could measure it, you could score it, you could see that those quadrants I talked about you rose when we reintroduced material that was too short at the beginning, because the story, you were more invested in the characters. And the truth is, time flies, you know, when you're happy, time goes really quickly. That's the paradox. When you're, you know, it's not always happy actually. When you're in a car crash, things go really slowly, and that's, you know, another version of that. But I think there's a paradox, and I always think of it like, I used to joke with Steve McQueen that it shouldn't be longer than double math at school. You know, when you had a double math lesson, that it should never be longer than 1 hour and 40 minutes, that's the gold standard of film. And that was the length of film that me and Steve grew up watching. You know, European films from the 60s and 70s were often 100 minutes, no longer than that. And that's, you know, but I don't think of it just about minutes. I think of it in terms of what is the project, you know, and, you know, an Instagram post is a social media post is a pamphlet, and then a television show is an episode is, you know, it's a novella maybe, and, you know, we're talking about a story with hundreds of characters and big events that need time, and it's you know, it's a proper novel. It should be a really satisfying narrative meal, for want of a better description. So I always felt like, although many people are reserved about length, the feedback I was getting is, look, what I was aiming for as an editor was to create something where you hopefully at the end of the film, you know, you're not exhausted, but that you are even maybe keen for some more, you know, and that was what I was aiming for. You know, maybe I'm deluded in thinking we nearly got there. You know, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, the world is changing, but there's an appetite. My daughters are the age that I think is very much an issue of attention span, is one of the biggest challenges. But they do want to kind of eat a substantial meal, and they like longer films, and also I think it's expensive to go out to the cinema now. It used to be cheap, it's not. And people want some reward, you know, and that they want to be rewarded with a really deep experience. It's not just about length. And if, you know, I will give as evidence that the most successful Marvel films have all been the long ones, and the least successful Marvel films have all been the short ones. So go figure. It's not always about minutes. It's to do with engagement and how happy you are watching it. Because if you're happy, time goes quickly. That's my view. Yeah, so the two questions are what software and when do you start controlling the musical flow of the film? Is that a fair reduction? So the answer is the industry standard is Avid. There's some rivalry, you know, there's Adobe Premiere, but the truth about Adobe Premiere, I would say, I haven't used it in anger, so I don't want really to be quoted on this, but my understanding is that Avid is much better for bigger teams, and we have 20 people who are accessing the material at the same time. And Avid has an advantage of being able to cope with multiple people accessing the material at the same time. It's to do with the storage systems, and I'm told that Adobe is better for smaller projects. I mean, I came up from film. I started on 8mm, 16, 35. I even did a bit of 8.5. I did high 8, low 8, U-matic, offline beta, SP. I did Lightworks. Oh, I did edit roll, which was awful. Then Lightworks, which was good for a while. Then Avid. So I kind of done most. And my answer would be, if it's shot on wet string and it's a good film, I will cut it on wet string. It doesn't, you know, it's not the knife, it's the fish. If you're a sushi chef, it's not just the knife. The knife is important, but it's the ingredients, right? So that's my answer about that. And then in terms of the musicality, it starts day one, right? I'm already thinking about the rhythm in the storyboard stage. I'm already building the sound. It's just, you know, everything is, somebody asked a composer, Harrison Birtwistle, he's a British contemporary composer. He only died recently. And a very perceptive student asked him, why from 1971 to 1986 did every single one of your pieces start on the note B? And he said, well, it was one less decision to make. And and I kind of feel like you've got to start somewhere and start building that musicality from day one. And of course, time gives you an experience and screenings, and time with your director gives you maybe, if you're lucky, 18 weeks of intensively working out the flow of the film. And that's when that really happens, where, you know, not in this case, but in other cases, I've worked on a film where the first assembly is 5 hours and you're trying to get it down to 2.5 hours. So a lot of that rhythm is to do with cutting what don't you need. So that process is intense for about 18 weeks, but it starts a year before. Thank you for that question. So the question was, what challenges were there for editing, considering that it was a novel, one novel divided into 2 parts? I think, you know, I will be honest with you and say that this is principally a challenge for the screenwriter, insofar as, you know, it was Eric Roth, who's a fantastic writer, famous for Forrest Gump, who was the first writer that worked with Denny that cracked the, you know, picked the lock of the book to say, where do we divide this? You could divide it later, which in the book would be around the spice orgy, for those that know the book. That would be one place, and it makes a certain sense to cut it there. But there are many reasons that they chose this way to divide it. And I mean, you have to bear in mind that they didn't shoot any of part 2 while we were working on part 1. So I had no idea. I didn't have a script of part 2. And we shot, I think, almost nothing from part 1 is used again or repurposed or was shot ahead. It was literally like, you know, God, this is a fucking big film. Let's try, just let us make this one. And then we know what we're going to do with 2, but just let's make this one first, because that's enough work, really. You know, I talked to the editor of Lord of the Rings, which shot simultaneously those episodes, you know, I think 3 films at the same time, right? And I said, how was it for you? You know, it was a 450-day shoot. I just kill myself, you know what I mean? I mean, Dune is long. It's 108 days, I think, or something like that. I could be wrong, but it's around 100 days of shooting. It's exhausting. At the end, you're just crying, you're just crying and going, haven't we got the film yet? Do we need it? Oh, I don't want any more dailies falling on me every day. You get like that. You can tell what I'm like. I'm not great company. But I asked John Gilbert, what's it like with 450 days? And he says, well, at the end of the first week, you're exhausted, and then it carries on like that. I haven't really answered your question. I think the honest truth is it's very much a screenwriter challenge. And, of course, with us, it was a little bit like, what can we explain now? What can we leave to explain later? And I think, to be honest, if I'm honest with you, Dune 2 was an easier film to cut because the balance of action and dialogue is, in my opinion, a little better. And that we weren't burdened by having to try and explain everything. We had to try and do Dune 1 to do a lot of exposition without, hopefully, people feeling it's pushed, at them. It has to be driven by what does the audience want to know, rather than what do we need to tell them. Do you understand? So it's kind of, it made Dune 1 hard. It does make Dune 1 harder than Dune 2. Dune 2, I think we just kind of lent into action-adventure and just made those scenes sing and be brilliant. That was the concentration. It wasn't, oh, God, can we live without this? Can we drop this? Can we amplify that? Do we need a bit more to explain this? Which part 1 was a lot like that. No, I understand. And the question was, what advice is there for people who are coming up as editors where they don't have access to the budgets and the large crews and the ability to reshoot and things like this and have budgetary constraint a little bit? What advice do I have? The only thing I'd say is, anyway, just as a principle, is that whatever I worked on, and I worked on some really limited things, and it was always to just always do your best, first of all. That's just the first principle. And you never know, really, in your own career, I don't think you ever know where the door is going to open to an opportunity that's going to be better than that. So I spent 3 years cutting 5-minute films for a show that was about teaching people how to come back from, being a mother and re-entering the workspace. So you can imagine that the budget for that show is really low. But I got to work with 5 directors a week for 3 years, and I learnt a little bit editor's bedside manner. Some of those directors were brilliant, and some of them were limited, but you had to make 5-minute films a week. And I did that for 3 years, and I learned to be really fast on my equipment, and I learned to be inventive. Can I go a little further into this? I will give you a bad experience, okay? There was a lady who, we didn't get on well at all. She picked a really bad subject, which was about a bank manager who was going to had given up the stressful life of being a bank manager and who transformed his career into being an owner of a hotel. But she picked the most boring fucking man in the world. He had nothing to say, and his interview was like 4 hours long. And it was all, could you tell me about what it was like being a banker? And he says, not good. No, not good. Not good at all. And it was like that. And you're going, it's meant to be a 3-4 minute film. And at one point, she asked him to reenact the heart attack that he had that made him become a bank manager, stop being a bank manager. And she got one shot for me, which was the guy grabbing the bottom of a staircase. Shot one. And shot 2
was him holding his chest and falling on the bed. And he did it once, and the camera didn't get it. And the guy said, I'm not well, I can't do this. I'm not allowed to, so they stopped doing that. So she went back to the producer, and the producer said, okay, you need to get some stuff from a hospital, and we haven't got the money, and you've spent all of your money, so you're gonna have to like film with a high-8 camera, go to a hospital and try and get some shots of like ambulances and things. You can, maybe the editor, Joe, can do something with that, So she took a high-8 camera and she followed an ambulance, and she got a shot of an ambulance door that was blurred, and her hand was in front of the camera, and the shot was 1 second and 18 frames long. And then the guy security saw that she was filming in a hospital and said, what the hell are you doing? Get the fuck off, you haven't got permission. And that's all I got from that shoot. She came in the following day and she said, this is the film we want to make. I want it to be like NYPD Blue. So, I learned. It wasn't good material, but I did everything I could. I had music, I turned everything blue, I did everything slow motion. I worked until there was a pool of sweat on the floor. And it wasn't my favorite day, but you always try and do your best. And I think also you can, I think a smaller film sometimes has, a lot more heart. You can see the heart in a story. And it's very difficult as editors for us to see that we're only, we all have egos. Everybody on a film crew thinks that they can do better than the director. It's just a fact. And you have to remember that we're only one part of the thing, and you'll discover that because 10 years later, you'll see that film and you'll see the film like an audience member, and you won't just see what you did or what you were limited by, and you'll understand that you're part of this big process, and we're all really lucky to be in this beautiful endeavor together. So it's like sometimes you can worry too much about some things, where actually it's not the most important thing. I don't know if that's at all helpful, but that's how I've always seen it. How do you build trust with a director? Sorry, say that last piece again.
Or vice versa.
Vice versa. Thank you, that's a good question. It's so good, I just don't know quite how to answer it. I think the truth is you have to shield the director, I think, a little bit. The cutting room has got to be a safe place for a director to play in and to make mistakes and to not feel stupid and to make some risky decisions, because it's going to be better for the film that if you try things, that you really try things. And I think I'm also, it's a certain question. These days, it's very difficult, for example, sharing material. I'm really careful not to let anything out of the cutting room. I was really pleased, for example, this is something I'm incredibly proud of, is that nobody knew that Anya Taylor-Joy was in the film until the premiere. So that's a secret that we kept from everybody. And that in Hollywood, let me tell you, a secret is almost the hardest thing to keep. Because everybody knows what everybody's doing, and you're all in communal spaces all the time. You're in a screening room and there's another film next door, and you know what's going on. And everybody knows when a film is being recut or reshooting and things like that. So to be able to prevent people from knowing, despite test screenings and despite press. So that's a very important way to kind of earn some trust, is that this material is safe and it's secure and that you're going to protect it with your life. I also think Denny does, one of the advantages I like about being the only editor and not a multiple editor is that I know everything.
I've seen everything. I do make a special case of watching every single thing. And that means you can gain a lot of trust when Denis says, for example, damn, you know, fuck. I wish I'd asked Ryan Gosling to be less angry just for one take, and yeah, it would be better if this wasn't shouted. And you can go, yeah, but do you know that you filmed a rehearsal? And that there was a rehearsal and it's marked as NG, no good, on the continuity sheets. But if we use the sound, it's only half power. He was kind of whispering bits of it. We could use that sound on his lips, and where it doesn't fit, I can cut away, I can cut to Ana de Armas. So you earn a lot of trust by knowing, you know, they can they can point you to a problem and you've got some things that you can bring. Because, you know, everybody forgets what they shot after a while. And also, in terms of why do I trust, in reverse, why do I trust Denis, is because he doesn't want to go back and look at all the takes again. Every time he's done that, he said, oh no, you picked the right one, you picked the best one. There's never, you know, there's very rarely a time where there's something that I didn't use that was better. You know, it's like, there's a selection process that he trusts me, and that means I will eternally love working with him, because it's, you feel as though that's been rewarded and recognized. Your kind of curatorship of his movie. So there's some examples. It's not the whole story, but it's a little bit of it. The question is, how would cutting a trailer affect how you cut a movie? Is that a fair? Okay, so the really great thing about trailers is that you're often using music, and music gives you permission to cut out of continuity, right? Because the beat is pushing, and you can compress, like a music video, you can go wildly into the future with every cut, right? And you don't have to care about it being smooth or to being, anything being sudden. And that's quite liberating for an editor. So what you might be referring to is the fact that the very first teaser of Blade Runner we cut in the cutting room. That was me and Denis. It might be that you're thinking of. And it was just really good, because it sort of informs the way that you want to cut the film. You sort of see the possibility of the film in a compressed form. And it's always really nice sometimes where you can tell the whole story, but without showing every minute of it. It's a montage, as they say, So I don't know. I would embrace it if they'd let me, but honestly, nowadays, most of the trailers for Dune are done by these incredible companies that do it all the time, and I sit in awe at what they do. And it's maybe better that people who don't know the film and don't have an allegiance to the way that the film really is do the trailer, because what trailers are about is getting people to come and see the film. It's not necessarily to represent the film. And my temptation would always to be not to show too much and to leave things for the audience who are going to pay to come and see it. So I really hate trailers that tell you the whole thing, right? And so I'm too angry to cut a trailer.
So thank you so much that you stayed here with us so long. I think it was extremely interesting. Joe, thank you so much. And
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Dziękuję moc.
hopefully we'll see you here in another 5 years or earlier.
Or my assistant on June 4. Thank you.
Good night.